Hey, how's it going? Welcome to another interview. And today I am joined by Jenny Tschiesche, who is a nutritionist and author of the wonderful book, Real Lunchtime Food, which I have ordered my copy of. And I'm very excited to receive it, hopefully today or tomorrow. But it only came out on Thursday. So Jenny, you've probably been quite busy the last couple of days, last few days, I imagine, with the launch and everything else.
Yeah, it's been pretty hectic in the lead up to the launch because on the same day as the launch, I was launching a new website as well. So pretty hectic. And then since then, yeah, slightly less hectic. I've given myself a bit of time off, but I need to keep going. I know, and keep promoting and all of that good stuff. But
Yes.
it's an exciting time. It's an exciting time and a strange time of year to launch a book, but still, it's going really well.
Well, look, I appreciate you coming on and having a chat with me today on this subject, because it's about, obviously it's about nutrition, but it's about more than that. It's about how do you get the theories and the good nutrition and the stuff that we know we should be doing and understand about, healthy food, and actually turn it into a practical reality. And that's what sort of I'm getting the sense of, that this book has a lot of. It's about lunchtime food, which is often a kind of a grab and go,
Yeah.
pick up a sandwich from a supermarket and the meal deal options. And this feels like it's the antithesis of
Yeah.
that. So I'd like to
Yeah.
get into a little bit about what the book is about. But first of all, kind of tell us a bit about some of the other work that you do with groups,
Yeah.
with organizations, because this isn't just about kind of writing books. You go in and you actually teach this stuff to schools and companies as well, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I describe myself as a nutrition educator, really,
Mhm.
because back in the day, I'm doing a careers talk later on today, but back in the day, I was always told I would be a PE teacher. Very sporty background, and I love teaching, but I didn't realize that until I found my passion. My passion, obviously, is nutrition. So I now work in the corporate well-being space. So I provide corporate well-being workshops, either on my own, where I'm talking just about nutrition, or amongst a group of people where we'll bring in experts. I work with quite a few former Olympic athletes who do stuff on resilience and stress. I work with a doctor of sleep. So quite often it's a complete solution that we're providing collectively and collaboratively. But I also work in sports nutrition. I work with a lot with teenage athletes and children, sporty children, because I think there's a lot that we're not necessarily getting right there. I'm a parent as well, so I come at with a very sporty child, so I come at it from that perspective. And I work with schools, teaching teachers how to teach nutrition. So, I do a lot of workshops and workshopping with people who are educators themselves as well. But that's really a passion for me.
Hey, we've got you back, and slightly different view as well now. So got
Sorry.
the connection going again. But you were just saying there before we lost the connection that a lot of the work you do is about educating educators, which I guess is a way of, it's a bit like dropping a pebble into a pond, and the ripples go out, and actually some of those ripples then turn into more pebbles that ripple out. So you're actually spreading the word to much larger numbers
Yeah.
by teaching people who are going to be in those positions of responsibility and able to teach other people.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, whether it's a sports coach, whether it's a teacher or head teacher or teaching assistant, whatever their role is as an educator themselves, they already have a trusted relationship. They're already reaching a number of other people. And if I can, add to their level of knowledge, the depth of knowledge around a certain area that they don't have as a speciality, then they can, impart that knowledge as a sort of an extra element to what they're already teaching. And certainly from a sort of sports coach's perspective, it's a really necessary element. What I found in my work in sport is that increasingly those sports that are well funded get the nutrition education that they deserve. Those sports that are not so well funded don't get the nutrition education they deserve. So it's about reaching all of those people, because without the right education, people don't actually progress. Those sports don't become the sort of sports that are going to get the funding. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
yeah, it's one of
yeah,
those things.
definitely. So tell me a bit before we get into the book. Tell me a bit more about your nutrition philosophies. How maybe you differentiate between general nutrition and sports nutrition. What are some of the
Yeah.
things? Because a lot of people who will be watching this will, maybe not sort of top flight sports people, but certainly people who are kind of recreational runners or
Yeah.
other sports. And this is a real point of interest, is the difference
Mm.
between the two. But kind of roughly, what are some of the philosophies that you hold around nutrition? Because there's so many different approaches.
There really are. And one of the things I'm very keen on is to get back in tune and back in touch with our intuition. So, one of the things that we appear to have lost is almost like our ability to read our own body. Now, every body is different, and everybody has their own personal, or should have their own personal nutritional approach. But increasingly people follow a way of eating, whether that's paleo, veganism, keto, whatever it is, or they follow a path that they believe is what they should be doing. But actually, it's a very individual thing. I'm a huge believer that once we discover, or at least get the knowledge that we require to be able to make decisions for ourselves, we're in a much more powerful position. But the reality is we are surrounded by lots of information and misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
We are also surrounded by a lot of foods that are, processed foods. They're not real foods.
There we go. We've got you back again. So we were just saying there about real food, and it was a real joy to hear you say that, because it's, I think, something that is so important to kind of move away from heavily processed packaged foods and have, doesn't have to be 100%, but certainly moving towards eating more real foods. What have been some of your observations of people as they've started to try and do that, and maybe some of the challenges that you've seen people experience along the way as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the main reasons that we've moved away from real food is because we are such a huge population, that we've expanded so quickly that the food industry has taken shortcuts. And they've done it for commercial reasons, but we've also been therefore sort of miseducated along the way. So I have to sort of undo some of that. So for example, quite a lot of the work that I do in corporates, I'm working with what we call blue collar workers, where, dare I say it, but running a workshop, the expectation is there's going to be a bacon sandwich for breakfast, and of course there is never a bacon sandwich for breakfast. So I have to explain why, what's happened to bacon, what bacon used to be, a food that we would eat, and it would be preserved in our own sort of homestead or farmstead. It wouldn't be preserved with the sorts of things now that we link to, carcinogenic properties. So, and simple things like bread. What happened to bread over the years? 1961, we brought in this new way of making bread called the Chorleywood bread making process, which is the process by which about 80% of the bread that we eat today is made. And why should we not be eating that? Why should we go back to what we think of as sort of posh sourdough style bread? But actually that was bread. That's what we used to call bread, prior to 1961. So just explaining those sort of things, there's some of the challenges that I face in my job. But certainly I think, once we start to get in touch with those real foods, and we look at the places in the world that never lost touch with real foods, those places like the blue zones, places where significant numbers of people live to over 100 years old, and we look at why, quite often they're eating not only real food, but they're eating seasonally, and they're actually not eating too much. One of the famous phrases, the Okinawan phrase, is "Harry Bachibu," or I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but it's only eat to 80% full. How many of us, particularly during this festive period, will overeat, stuffed, couldn't eat another thing. So, just eating seasonally, eating the right kinds of foods for our body, even that generally that is seasonal wherever you are in the world, but also not overeating, I think, is really important too.
Yeah. Really interesting actually to hear you talking about what we eat now, like bread and bacon. You use those couple of examples there, and it's certainly an argument that I've seen and heard many times, not just with those particular foods, but bread, for example. We've been eating bread for centuries. Why all of a sudden now is it bad? And the reality is, as you just pointed out there, from 1961, I wasn't aware of that, by the way, but I knew that bread had changed significantly over the last little while, and it's different. It's a different food now to what it was when those kind of stories started coming up, that we've always lived on this, we've always used it, it's never been a problem. Why is it a problem now? So actually unpicking and unpacking some of those false beliefs that we have about the food that we're eating and how harmless they are I think it's fascinating actually to hear some of that.
It's almost unpicking history. It's what's happened historically to our food, which, like you say, we still call bread, but the bread that we're eating 80% of the time today, the sort of the commercially wrapped bread, the sort of bread that you can screw up into a ball in your hand, you can't do that with real bread. And that is a sort of, that's a change that we have to be aware of, but most people aren't, because it's not common knowledge. And so once you find out these things, and most people, when I explain to them, to even look at the ingredients label on products, real versus the more commonly available version of it now, and you'll see ingredients that your grandmother wouldn't recognize, which I know is taking a phrase from Michael Pollan, whom I'm a big believer in, a guy in the States. But it is, if your grandmother doesn't recognize the ingredients, then it's probably your body wouldn't either.
Yeah. Well, look, one of the problems, I guess, or problem areas is lunch, and this is the crux of the book. Often there's a lot of talk about breakfast and starting the day, on a good meal, and there's obviously a lot of debate around whether that's even necessary, certainly now. And is a bowl of high sugar cereal really the best way of starting a day? But there's also a lot of talk about dinners and like getting evening meals sorted and plan for that. And certainly if you've got that planning in place and you've got that nailed, then that does take care of a lot of the potential problems when it comes to getting healthy nutrition in. But lunch is one of those challenges, because most of us, or many of us, are out of the house around lunchtime, where we don't have easy access to kind of make food, on a cooker or whatever. So we feel like we're restricted somewhat there, and grabbing a sandwich or making a sandwich to take with us kind of seems like the only option. So what are some of the approaches that you've taken with the book and the recipes that you've included that help people overcome that without taking up like masses of time in the process?
Yeah, I think we've all got to have a reason to want to change anything that we're doing. So part of the reason for the book was to give people that reason. It was to help people understand, for example, that in the UK, we should be eating, every adult should be eating 30 grams of fiber, but on average, we're eating 18 grams of fiber per day. And quite a lot of that boils down to the fact that we're not getting sufficient vegetables in our diet. We know we should be eating 5 a day, and I hate to keep on throwing stats, but on average 30% of adults, only 30% of adults are doing that. And it gets far worse for children. Struggle, I get that, but the reality is this middle of the day meal is really quite important. We've still got the rest of the day at school to work, or the rest of the day at work to work, and so many people that I speak to are exhausted. They experience that mid-afternoon lull. They really genuinely feel that they could just pop their head on their desk, or get into the sort of that footwell area underneath the desk and just have a little kip and they'd be fine. But a lot of that comes down to, and I know because I used to get this wrong, before I studied nutrition, I was incredibly sporty, but really struggle with my energy levels, particularly that mid-afternoon, and then particularly as we go on into the evening, not being fully fueled. If you wanted to do any evening training or activities, or dare I say, have the motivation to go to the gym, you just didn't have it in you because you hadn't fueled your body in the right way. So just understanding some of the simple principles about what gives you that longer lasting energy, that combination of the right kinds of foods. And so what I've done with the book is I try to break that down into, well, let's not change too much too quickly, but if you are already at the moment having a sandwich, but you find that isn't sustaining you, maybe change the bread. If you find that you don't want to change the bread, but you just still want to have something like a sandwich, I've got a whole section called Not Just Sandwiches, which is kind of where this whole thing started. This, before I was called Lunchbox Doctor, my blog, etc., was called Not Just Sandwiches. And so the reality was I was trying to find alternatives to sandwiches. So there's a whole load of those. If you like something crispy and crunchy in your lunch, even things like crisps, dare I say it, but there are tons of alternatives. Now, the most obvious grab and go one would be something like nuts. There's lots of healthier versions of those on the market, but also, things like chickpeas, and, you can just pop those in the oven with a few spices on them, and they immediately turn into these lovely, crispy, crunchy chickpeas. And there's some science behind that we really enjoy things that crunch. I think it's because the proximity of the mouth to the ear, but that's probably why we love our crunchy snacks as much as we do. But even if you're buying shop bought versions of those, just look at the ingredients labels. One of the examples that I give in the book is, your classic, probably the biggest well-known brand of tangy cheese tortilla chips versus a plainly salted or lightly salted version of that. And you can see it, just stark contrast when you look at the two ingredients labels one alongside the other, how much more you're putting into your body, how much more you're asking of your body if you go for the highly processed version versus the alternative, which is still a processed food but a lot simpler.
Mhm.
I've also got some ideas for soups, simple soups and hot meals. I'm a big believer in an insulated flask. But if you've
Mhm.
got an insulated flask, one thing that you can do so easily is take last night's leftovers. Of all the meals in the day, the
Yeah.
one that we probably give the most thought to is the evening meal. It's
Yeah.
probably the most balanced one as well. So why not produce too much of it and then make sure that the following day, and I always believe leftovers taste better anyway than the meal did the first time around, but heat it up and put it into your insulated flask. That really doesn't take long. It really
Yeah.
doesn't take that
Yeah.
much time. You could do that whilst you were having your breakfast. And then I talk about hydration, because most of us go around mildly dehydrated. And so a really important component of our lunch or our day-to-day living is to make sure that we're fully hydrated. And simple things like, looking at the color of your urine to check that you're hydrated is really important, but also just looking for signs and symptoms that you might be dehydrated. Even moodiness can be a sign that you're dehydrated.
Mhm.
So, it might be something just to try and keep on top of. So I talk about how you would transport, meals to work and school, but also bottles that you would transport drinks in, because the most unappealing thing is probably warm water, which has been sitting in a car or has been sitting in an office or is a little bit stale. So how can you make things a bit more interesting in order that you do stay hydrated?
Yeah, so kind of the two things that I'm kind of getting from this is, first of all, three things. One is it's actually small steps. It's not trying to
Mm,
completely, change everything overnight. And if you're having sandwiches, then how can you get better bread? If you don't want to change the
yeah,
bread, how can you kind of change what's inside it, and so it's not just
yeah.
a sandwich, as you put it there. And the lunchbox doctrine, by the way, I forgot to kind of use that as your intro. It's a great thing to go by. Really just say what you do. And so the second thing I took away from that is that a lot of the tips and the recipes that you've got in there it's about speed, and it's about
Yeah,
acknowledging that we're not all going to have masses of time to kind of cook up and prepare loads of really exotic meals. So actually,
yeah,
I'm sure there are options for if you have got a bit more time. But just heating up a pan of last night's leftovers, it
yeah.
takes it's almost zero time, because you've
Mm,
got it done and you just cook it up and you put it in the flask. But even if
yeah,
it takes you 5 minutes, 10 minutes, then what an investment that is
yeah,
on and what you get back later on in the day in terms of energy and productivity levels and just how you feel by having higher nutrition food.
yeah.
So I think that's kind of a big thing there. And the third thing for me was just the importance of taste
Mm,
and enjoying the food that we have as well. That
yeah.
this kind of sounds like it's something that you've really taken into consideration. That it's not just about, well, look, you can eat healthy, but it's gonna be boring. Like, who wants to
Yeah,
eat
no, it
boring
really
food?
isn't. And one of the phrases that we use quite a lot, we eat with our eyes.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I found increasingly is if I look at people's lunches, quite often the most colourful thing is the packaging, not the ingredients, or not what the contents of the lunch. So just starting to think about colour, actually. And again, there was a study done in the 1970s that showed that when we find food visually appealing, we absorb more nutrients from it. And the
Really?
thinking behind that is that we start to salivate, we start to get excited by
Okay.
food when it looks good. And so we start to produce more digestive secretions, more stomach acid. We probably therefore break down the food more efficiently, more effectively, and we're able to take the nutrients out of the food that we're consuming. And so that's a really interesting element. So if food
Mm.
looks appealing, and it tastes great, but it's actually giving us, like you say, benefits. What's
Yeah.
not to love? Why would we go for the meal deal? Why would we just grab and go when actually that's making us feel so much worse in the afternoon? But you've got to start feeling the benefits before you really probably understand the motivation for continuing to invest that small amount of time in creating a better lunch.
Yeah, no, I'm a big believer in understanding why we're doing what we're doing, and otherwise it just
Yeah,
ends up being just a chore, something else that we feel like we should be doing or that we're failing at. We don't really understand the true benefits of doing it, and sometimes it can be a longer term. I mean, you have a real heavy, high carb lunch, then you're going to feel the downside of that quite soon afterwards. But some of these benefits that you get from eating more healthily, they can take a little while to really come out, and
yeah,
maybe a few days, maybe a couple of weeks. And there's obviously a little bit of friction there because you're trying new things, you're doing things differently, and it is going to take maybe a few moments longer, certainly a little bit
mm,
more thought power to put
mm,
new things into place. So really believing in the reasons, believing in the benefits and locking that down as you're doing those things, as well as you're building those new habits, new ways of doing things is really, really important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very important. And also to think of nutrition as one of the many cogs in the wheel. You know, what people generally find is if they start making changes in one area, they find the impetus, the energy, the desire, and the motivation to want to make changes in another area. If people move more, they tend to want to eat more healthily, or if they eat more healthily, they tend to have the energy to move more, just as one very simple, you know, two cog example.
Yeah. And we mentioned at the beginning there about the difference between nutrition and sports nutrition. Are there any massive differences between how somebody who's very active should eat and how somebody who's just interested in kind of general health and wellness should eat?
Yeah, so I tend to say to the sports nutrition people that I'm working with that it's really important for them to focus on their recovery. I think it's one of the areas of health that doesn't get looked at enough. So whilst, you know, I played National League hockey myself, and that's where my initial interest in nutrition was sort of sparked. And I remember doing a lot around carb loading, which was, you know, it was useful at the time. We're talking quite a long time ago now. But what I've now found and what I realize increasingly is a lot of people know about protein and they know about carbohydrates, but they don't necessarily know about the value and the effects of omega-3 fatty acids. They don't necessarily know about the value and the effects of antioxidants. And they certainly don't think sufficiently about recovery. And I find recovery is one of those really important windows of opportunity that so many people don't get right, particularly athletes, you know, because generally we're talking about people who are fitting this in and probably a lot of exercise, sometimes over stressing the body. Now they've got that really finite window. We tend to say sort of 20 to 30 minutes after they finished exercising, where they've really got to tell their body to start repairing and, you know, getting ready, preparing for the next bout of exercise or the next competition. And that key message is probably the one thing that I focus on most with the athletes I work with.
Right. Yeah. So the recovery message, you mentioned some kind of key areas there, like antioxidants and omega-3s. It's not just about getting carbs in for the energy, something that we've been told, you know, so we're blue in the face for many years, mainly by the sports nutrition industry, but also the whole kind of past the parties before races. It seems that that's, you know, that's it's still there, but more people, I think, are understanding that there is more to it, and actually that importance of recovery as well. If you're doing back-to-back training sessions, then it becomes more important. If you're training 3 times a week and it's light or moderate intensity, then probably less important to really prioritize getting the nutrients in within that recovery window. It's still beneficial, but less so because you've got more time between sessions. But if you're doing 4, 5, 6 days a week where you are training at a high level, high intensity, then it increases the importance of it, so that your body doesn't then break down over a period of time and end up with you being depleted and overtrained and stressed and potentially injured.
Well, I have seen that even in quite young athletes. I've seen stress fractures. I've seen immune systems absolutely pummeled because they don't realize, and they actually don't make the connection between nutrition and their immune system, or nutrition and how ill they are, or how injured, how easily injured they are. And it's only when you start to talk about that, and, you know, also in relation to digestive health. You know, I've written a book on gut health, and I'm a big believer that the gut is very central and core to so much of our overall health and well-being. And so many of us don't actually focus on that sufficiently either. So starting to think about, you know, that simple fact that I gave you earlier on about fiber, just making sure you get enough fiber is one of the key contributors to optimal gut health. But again, how many of us really know that, or at least understand that that connection exists and how to address it? Where do we actually get fiber from? You know, so helping, you know, athletes and other people alike, you know, just to understand those simple things is really important and very empowering.
Yeah, no, totally agree. So look, Jenny, thanks again for joining me today. Your website, lunchboxdoctor.com, is probably the best place to send people to go and check out and find out a bit more information about you there. There's links to all of your books, including the one, Real Lunchtime Food, is the one that certainly is just launched last week, and I bought my copy of it. Looking forward to that arriving later today. And thanks again for spending the time with us today and telling us a little bit more about your views and approaches to nutrition.
Thank you very much, George.